This is episode 21, where we ask, are we defined by the stories we tell or by the suffering we can't ignore?
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're tackling a really big one today. We're plunging into Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and specifically his thoughts on, well, meaning.
The search for meaning.
Exactly. And our mission here is really to understand the core question Harari seems to be asking. What is the meaning of life? And maybe even more pressingly, how do we even start to find it when everything we think we know keeps shifting, often because of science?
Right. And Harari frames this whole search in a very particular way. He kicks off with this fundamental idea. Humans, Homo sapiens, were storytelling animals.
Storytelling animals, okay.
Yeah, we don't just crunch numbers, we think in stories, in narratives. And when we're looking for meaning, Harari argues, we're actually searching for a story, a big story maybe, that explains reality and, crucially, gives us a role to play in this sort of cosmic drama. Okay, let's dig into that. Life is a story. Harari talks about different kinds of stories that have historically given people that sense of meaning. He starts with what he calls circular story.
Right. The circular ones.
Yeah.
These are the narratives that emphasize an eternal cycle, a kind of natural order almost. Think about something like the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, where the warrior Arjuna is taught that his meaning, his purpose, comes from his dharma, his specific path, his duty. And the key thing isn't really what the duty is. It could be a prince, could be a warrior.
Or even something seemingly humble.
Exactly. He uses the example of a washerwoman. If she follows her path devoutly, she's finding just as much meaning as anyone else. It's about fulfilling your role in that cycle.
And he brings in a modern example, too, which I thought was quite clever. Disney's The Lion King.
Yeah. Simba's whole journey. Right?
Yeah.
It's all about accepting his place in the circle of life, where every creature has its role, contributing to the whole system. Simba's meaning is completely tied up in accepting that destiny, returning to his fixed place in that repeating cycle.
So these circular stories, they offer a kind of stability, an eternal reality where your identity is sort of given.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Peace comes from fitting into that predetermined role within the never-ending cycle.
But that's not the only game in town. He then contrasts this with linear stories.
Right. Linear stories. These have a clear beginning, a middle, and crucially an end point they're heading towards. Think of, say, the traditional Muslim narrative.
Okay.
Creation, the beginning, then the revelation of God's laws, and it's all moving towards a final judgment day. So your meaning comes from following Allah's commands within that timeline.
Suddenly, everyday actions take on huge significance.
Exactly. Washing your hands, what you eat, what you drink, it's all part of this cosmic progression towards that final resolution.
Nationalism fits this linear model, too, right? He uses Zionism as an example.
He does. It traces this line from, a biblical past through the trauma of exile and the Holocaust, leading to the creation of the modern state of Israel, and then looking forward to a future where Israel is like a beacon for the world.
And your personal meaning gets tied into that national story.
Right. Building the nation, advancing its cause. He mentions those songs Israeli kids sing about building a house, planting a tree.
For the land, yeah. Taking simple actions and making them part of this grand, unfolding national epic.
Or communism, another linear story. History is seen as this inevitable march of class struggles, right? And it's all heading towards the proletariat's victory and this future communist paradise.
So your personal job becomes speeding that up.
Basically, yeah. Whether it's writing pamphlets or, as Harari kind of amusingly puts it, arguing with your capitalist father-in-law over dinner, the mundane becomes part of the grand historical mission.
What I found really interesting was his point about the scale of the story. It often doesn't seem to matter that much to believers.
Right. Some stories feel vast, cosmic, like the circle of life. Others, like nationalism. Well, cosmically speaking, they're tiny, focused on one group, one small bit of land, for a blink of an eye in universal time.
He makes that comparison with Jerusalem being called the eternal capital.
Yeah, a city maybe 5,000 years old versus a universe that's, 13.8 billion years old? Yet people make immense sacrifices for this idea of an eternal connection to something that, in the grand scheme, is pretty fleeting.
He shares that personal story about being a teenager at a Memorial Day ceremony in Israel.
Oh, right. Contemplating dying for the nation.
Yeah, and then having the sudden realization, if he were actually dead, he wouldn't be there to hear the poems honoring him. That physical reality it punctured the story, Made the idea of living on in the nation feel a bit abstract, maybe, hollow.
I think that really gets to the core of why all these stories are so powerful, though. They give us a role, an important one, and
Mhm.
they embed us in something that feels much, much bigger than just our own little lives.
Combats that feeling of insignificance.
Exactly. And they're often really good at keeping us focused within the story. Harari mentions the turtles all the way down idea
Yeah. The world on an elephant, on a turtle.
on another turtle, and so on. But instead of asking what the bottom turtle is standing on the fundamental question, we get caught up in the details within the story. Like, oh, the elephant flapping his ears causes hurricanes.
So the story distracts you with its own internal logic so you don't question the premise.
Precisely. Like the communists debating tiny points of revolutionary strategy, getting lost in the weeds, maybe forgetting to ask about the proletariat's ultimate place in cosmic evolution. The story's details become the main event.
Okay, so the takeaway here is that we seem wired to find meaning through stories. Circular, linear, doesn't matter. They give us a role, connect us to something bigger, and often work by keeping us focused on the plot, not the foundations.
Absolutely. And it doesn't just stop at these grand narratives. People also find meaning by trying to leave something more tangible behind.
Like what?
Well, maybe a soul that gets reborn, or passing on your genes, or creating something lasting, a cultural legacy like a poem, an invention, a piece of music.
He tells that really poignant story about his grandmother's family in Poland.
Yeah, wiped out in the Holocaust. Their whole world, their stories, reduced to just faded photographs.
Hmm.
And because they left nothing else, no counter-narrative of their own, they could be easily sort of recruited after death into causes they might not have even supported.
Wow, that's heavy.
It is. Or, there's the simpler story of just trying to make the world a better place, seeing yourself as one link in a great chain of kindness.
Right, the wise old man anecdote. His purpose is to help others.
But then he still doesn't know why the other people are there. It kind of leaves that ultimate question unanswered.
And then there's the really personal one, romance.
Ah, yes, the story that shrinks the entire universe down to, like, the beloved's earlobe or eyelash.
Uh-huh, yeah. It's all about the here and now, focused entirely on one person.
If you're in love, that person becomes the meaning of everything. If you're not, then the story gives you this powerful goal. Find true love. That becomes the quest.
So we've got cosmic stories, national ones, personal legacies, romance, all providing meaning. But then Harari throws a spanner in the works.
A pretty big one. He basically says, look, according to our best current scientific understanding, none of these stories are likely objectively true.
Oof. They're human inventions. Fictions.
That's the claim.
Mm.
The universe, as science understands it, just doesn't seem to operate like a story with inherent meaning or purpose. Any story claiming to reveal the ultimate meaning is probably something we've made up and projected onto reality.
Okay, so if they're probably not true, why do we cling to them so tightly? Why do people believe so fiercely?
Well, Harari gives a few reasons. One is just personal identity. From the moment we're born, we're immersed in a story. Our sense of self gets completely built on it.
Like the treasure hunt analogy he uses.
Exactly. Your parents bury the treasure, give you the map. By the time you might think to question if the treasure is real, you're already deeply invested in the hunt itself. The story feels like you.
And it's not just personal, right? It's social, too.
Hugely. Our collective institutions, governments,
Yeah.
laws, economic systems, social norms, they are all built on top of these shared stories. So doubting the core story, well, it feels incredibly threatening, not just personally, but socially. It feels like questioning the foundations of everything.
He uses that weight of the roof analogy.
Yeah, I thought that was powerful. The stories aren't held up by strong evidence, like solid foundations. They're held up by the sheer weight of all the institutions we've built on them pressing down. Removing the story feels like the whole roof will collapse.
He points to that centuries-long split in Christianity over one word, filioque.
Right. 1,000 years of schism between Western and Eastern Christianity, wars fought, immense hostility, all stemming from adding that one little Latin word meaning "and the Son" to the Nicene Creed, describing how the Holy Spirit proceeds.
It wasn't necessarily the theological point itself causing the wars.
Probably not, in objective terms. It was the challenge to the established story, the established authority, the institutions built around that specific version of the story. Questioning it felt like an attack on the whole structure.
So doubting becomes almost unthinkable, not because the evidence for the story is overwhelming, but because the consequences of doubting seem catastrophic, personal and social cataclysm.
That seems to be his point. The stability of the roof feels more important than checking the foundations too closely.
Okay, so we believe these fictions because our identities and our societies are built on them, making doubt feel really dangerous.
Yeah, And if they are fictions, how do you make them feel so incredibly real, so powerful? That's where rituals come in.
Ah, the hocus pocus X is Y idea.
Exactly. Rituals are like these magical acts almost, that take an abstract idea, God, the nation, the revolution, and make it feel concrete, tangible, something you can interact with.
Performance makes the symbol real. Like the Christian mass bread becomes the body of Christ. You literally consume the divine.
Right. Or going way back, those ancient Hindu texts interpreting a horse sacrifice.
Yeah.
Its head is the dawn, its eye is the sun. The ritual doesn't just represent the cosmos. It enacts it, makes it present.
And it works for mundane things too. Gestures, clothing.
Absolutely. Bowing, wearing specific headgear like a kippah or a hijab, even food rituals. Eating honey for a sweet new year in Judaism, or bitter herbs at Passover to physically taste the bitterness of slavery. It connects the body to the story.
Politics uses this all the time. Crowns, thrones.
Military parades, saluting the flag. Harari mentions Napoleon saying soldiers would die for a colorful ribbon, a seemingly small symbol given immense power through ritual and shared belief. Confucius understood this deeply, the importance of rites, levy for social harmony. It's arguably why Confucian cultures have been so stable.
So in the modern world, it's the same mechanism. Two sticks become a cross, a poster becomes the revolution.
A flag becomes the nation. You can't really touch France or India, right? They're abstract ideas. But you can see, touch, salute the flag. He uses that example of the huge Indian flag, the Tiranga, at the border with Pakistan.
Right, the sheer cost and effort involved in maintaining it.
Makes the idea of India feel incredibly real and present right there in a way that, say, talking about sewage systems or economic policy doesn't, even though those things are arguably more concretely real for people's lives. The cost makes the symbol potent.
And that leads directly to what Harari calls the most powerful ritual, sacrifice.
Yeah. Because, he argues, suffering feels like the most undeniably real thing in the world. If you suffer for something, it must be real, right?
The alchemy of sacrifice. Explain that.
It's this psychological process. When you endure hardship for a story, maybe you fast for religious reasons, maybe you lose a leg fighting for your country, maybe you spend a fortune on a luxury car to live out a consumerist dream, that very real, undeniable suffering makes you believe the story must be true.
Because the alternative is...
That you suffered for nothing, that you were a fool, and nobody wants to believe that about themselves. So the suffering, paradoxically, strengthens the belief in the story that demanded it. It proves your commitment. Not the story's truth, but it feels like it proves the truth.
The more you sacrifice, the more invested you become.
Totally. And it's not just about convincing yourself. Sacrifice is incredibly powerful for persuading others. Think about martyrs.
Right. How dare you say they died for nothing?
Exactly. It creates this huge emotional pressure to uphold the value of their sacrifice, and therefore the truth of the story they died for. He mentions the Shiite ritual of Ashura, reenacting the martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala, sometimes involving self-flagellation. It makes that ancient suffering intensely present and real year after year. Every day is Ashura.
And then there's the flip side, inflicting suffering on others for the story.
Yeah, that's the darker alchemy. If you commit violence in the name of your story, burning heretics, purging class enemies, sacrificing people to ancient gods, the psychological justification becomes, well, either this story is true and righteous, or I am a monster.
So the violence reinforces the belief to avoid confronting your own cruelty.
It seems so. He gives that awful example from Mashhad in Persia, where Jews were massacred and forced to convert because of a misunderstanding related to the Shiite holy day of Ashura. The violence served to solidify the perpetrator's sense of righteousness within their story.
And he makes that provocative point about monotheists.
Yeah, that despite often condemning literal human sacrifice, they historically killed far more people in the name of their god through holy wars, inquisitions, persecutions, than many polytheistic cultures who practiced ritual sacrifice. It's a chilling thought.
Sacrifices don't have to be bloody, though. He mentioned the Sabbath travel restrictions in Israel.
Right. That's a non-bloody sacrifice. But by imposing this difficulty, especially on poorer people who rely on public transport, the religious parties demonstrate the strength and seriousness of their faith. They show themselves, and the world, that they believe so much they're willing to cause this inconvenience. It validates their commitment.
And sometimes sacrifice acts as a kind of substitute.
Yeah, like maybe it's really hard to follow all the complex ethical rules of your religion perfectly, but if you donate a lot of money to build a temple, or you support a campaign against a rival group, that becomes your tangible proof of faith. It's an easier, more concrete way to demonstrate loyalty than constant spiritual struggle.
Okay, so rituals, and especially sacrifice and suffering, are key to making these fictional stories feel intensely real and binding us to them.
Definitely. But Harari points out, most of us don't actually put all our eggs in one story basket. We tend to operate with an identity portfolio.
An identity portfolio, like
Yeah,
stocks.
kind of, yeah. You might be, say, a devout Muslim, but also fiercely Italian and a committed capitalist and a loving husband and maybe a scientist too. All these identities come with their own stories, their own values.
And they don't always line up neatly.
Often they don't. That's where cognitive dissonance comes in. He's examples like, a Tea Party supporter trying to square their Christian faith with opposition to welfare and strong support for gun rights. Or maybe a progressive activist who believes in radical change but also has a healthy stock market portfolio. We manage to hold these conflicting ideas somehow.
But some ideologies demand total commitment to one story, right? Like fascism.
Exactly. Fanatical creeds like fascism demand exclusive loyalty. Harari defines fascism literally from the fasces, the Roman bundle of rods symbolizing collective power. The core idea is that the individual is weak and insignificant, but the collective, the nation, is supreme and all-powerful.
And he warns that it can be seductive.
Very. It's not always presented as jackboots and hate. It can be about national pride, unity, strength. Looking in the fascist mirror, Harari says, you see your nation as the most beautiful thing in the world, and the urge to just dissolve your small self into that glorious, powerful collective can be overwhelming. That's part of its danger.
But even under those regimes, people held on to other identities.
Often, yes. He suggests people kept backup stories, family ties, regional loyalties, professional identities. And this might explain, for instance, how Germany managed to recover relatively quickly after the collapse of Nazism. People hadn't completely erased all other parts of themselves.
He even sees this dissonance in modern extremist groups, like ISIS seeking revenge for martyrs.
Right. If you truly believe martyrs go instantly to paradise, why would you focus on earthly revenge for their deaths? Wouldn't you want more people to achieve martyrdom? It suggests a contradiction, a holding of conflicting beliefs even within that extreme framework.
Like those Crusader knights he mentioned.
Yeah, believing death in battle meant instant salvation, but when captured, often choosing captivity over being killed, maybe hedging their bets just a little on that promise of paradise.
So historically, we juggle multiple stories. But modernity brings a shift. Doubt becomes okay.
Yet Harari argues that in modern culture there's been a flip. Doubt is often framed as freedom, like Hamlet's famous uncertainty being seen as heroic, while blind faith can look like slavery.
And modernity becomes like a big supermarket of stories.
A supermarket at Elsinore, as he puts it. You can browse, pick and choose your identity, your meaning. And if you're not sure about any ultimate cosmic story, the meaning shifts to the act of choosing itself.
Which leads us to the liberal story.
Right. Liberalism, in Harari's telling, basically says, okay, forget the grand cosmic dramas. The real drama, the source of meaning, is within us, inside the individual human.
The universe is just atoms, but we create the meaning.
Exactly. Through our free choices, our feelings, our creativity. That becomes our cosmic vocation, in a sense.
And the commandments are, be free, create.
Pretty much. Fight for liberty. Express yourself. Write poems, explore your sexuality, invent an app, challenge dictators, educate girls, cure cancer, build spaceships. It's all validated by this focus on individual freedom and creation as the source of meaning.
But then, science comes knocking again.
Yep. Harari argues that the scientific picture of life challenges this liberal story too. That feeling of freedom, that spark of creativity. Maybe it's not some magical inner essence. Maybe it's just complex biochemical algorithms running in our being.
The free will problem.
Exactly. Are we really free? We might feel free to act on our desires, sure, but are we free to choose what we desire in the first place? Where do those desires come from?
Biochemical processes, cultural conditioning.
Likely a mix of both, operating largely outside our conscious control. Uses sexual orientation as an obvious example. It's not typically something people feel they chose.
And realizing this lack of control, it could be depressing.
Or, Harari suggests, maybe liberating. If you understand your desires and opinions arise from these impersonal processes, perhaps you become less obsessed with them, less identified with them. Maybe it's better to understand yourself, the process is shaping you, than just blindly chase every whim your brain chemistry throws up.
And he takes it even further, questioning the self itself.
He does. He suggests that the very feeling of having a single, stable self, that inner narrator telling your life story, might also be a fiction, a story constantly being spun by the mind.
Like a government spin doctor inside your head.
Haha, yeah, something like that. Constantly editing the past, rationalizing the present, projecting futures, creating a coherent narrative that might not match the messy reality of moment-to-moment experience.
He uses social media as a clear example.
Perfect example. We curate this idealized self online, the perfect photos, the witty updates. We filter out the bad bits, the boring bits. A traffic jam becomes a scenic view.
And we mistake that curated story for the real us.
Easily done. But the online self is often just visual, flat. Our actual experience is embodied, messy. The itchy mosquito bite, the stomachache, the boredom behind the smiling selfie.
So to understand ourselves, don't focus on the story.
Focus on the raw data. Observe the actual flow of sensations, thoughts, feelings in your body and mind before the narrator spins them into a neat story about you. As Harari puts it quite bluntly, you are not a story.
Wow, okay. That feels like a radical departure, and it leads him towards Buddhism.
Yes. He presents Buddhism as a perspective that goes even further than liberalism's challenge. Buddhism, in this interpretation, denies both the traditional cosmic stories and the liberal story of the meaning-making inner self.
So, no meaning anywhere.
Pretty much. Life has no inherent ultimate meaning. Feelings are just vibrations, temporary changing phenomena. The truth is what it is. Get over it, is the sort of bracing message he draws from it.
Instead of elaborate interpretations, just observe.
Observe plainly. Hairs are hairs, bones are bones, breath is just air moving. No need to overlay a grand narrative onto the raw reality of experience.
He talks about the three basic realities in Buddhism.
Right, anicca. Everything is constantly changing, impermanent. Anatta. Nothing has a fixed, enduring essence or soul. And dukkha. Because things are impermanent and lack a solid core, nothing can provide lasting, ultimate satisfaction. Suffering arises because we don't see this clearly, and we keep grasping for permanence, for an eternal God, an immortal nation, a lasting self, undying love, and hating anything that threatens our imagined grasp on these things.
And the way out is?
The Buddha's advice, Harari says, boils down to do nothing. But crucially, that's mental inaction. Stop the mind's relentless factory churning out stories, identities, desires, attachments, judgments.
But isn't there a danger there? Can no story become its own story?
Absolutely. That's the potential trap Harari points out. The quest for enlightenment itself can become another grand, linear narrative. You can get attached to the identity of being a meditator, argue with unbelievers, develop rituals and dogmas around non-attachment.
And historically, Buddhist practice hasn't always meant peace.
He gives some stark examples. Wars between Buddhist kingdoms like Burma and Siam. He mentions a Burmese king looting Siamese temples, then using the wealth to build Buddhist pagodas, while executing thousands of prisoners. A clear clash with the core teachings.
And the Japanese Buddhist nationalists in the 20th century.
Yeah, a deeply disturbing case where Buddhist doctrines were twisted to support extreme nationalism, militarism, and imperialism. Preaching self-sacrifice for the emperor while justifying horrific violence in places like Nanjing and Manila.
And even today, he mentions the monk in Myanmar.
Shinrathu, yeah. Leading an anti-Muslim movement, using Buddhist language while allegedly inciting hatred and violence. It shows how easily even teachings about compassion and non-attachment can be distorted into just another us versus them story when the human drive to create enemies takes over.
So just adopting a philosophy, even Buddhism, isn't a magic bullet. The human tendency to twist things into stories, often with enemies, is incredibly strong.
That seems to be the warning. Peace won't come just from finding the right doctrine or meditating enough, because we're masters at turning any truth into a self-serving fiction.
No. Okay, so if all these stories, cosmic, national, liberal, even the attempt at no story can be misleading fictions, what's left? Where does Harari land?
He brings it back to something fundamental, reality. It does exist, separate from our stories about it. And he argues, letting go of the stories, the narratives, allows us to see that reality more clearly.
And the focus shifts from what's the meaning of life to
something much more practical, more direct. How do we get out of suffering? He suggests that liberation comes not from finding the perfect story, but from understanding the truth about yourself and the world. That knowledge itself can free you from the misery caused by chasing illusions and being enslaved by your own mind's fictions.
And the key test of reality, the thing we can't deny,
is suffering. He circles back to this. Suffering, he argues, is the bedrock, the most real thing we experience.
He asks that question again, can a nation suffer?
Right. Referencing that Polish poet calling Poland the Christ of nations. But Harari insists, Poland is a metaphor. A nation doesn't have nerves, consciousness. It can't feel pain. Its suffering is symbolic.
It represents the suffering of actual people.
Exactly. He contrasts the metaphorical suffering of Poland with the undeniably real suffering of, say, a specific woman in Warsaw being brutalized by soldiers. Her pain is not a metaphor, it's real. Even if that suffering was caused by people believing in fictions, nationalism, ideology, whatever, the suffering itself is the undeniable reality.
Which leads to that strong warning he gives about political language.
Yeah, be extremely wary when leaders start using grand mystical terms, sacrifice, eternity, purity, redemption. He calls it hogwash, often used to obscure or justify actual, concrete human suffering.
His advice is to translate it.
Translate the hogwash into reality. When they talk about national sacrifice, picture a soldier crying in agony. When they talk about purity, picture a woman beaten and brutalized. When they talk about redemption, picture a child shaking in fear. Force yourself to see the real human cost hidden behind the abstract words.
So his final point in this whole section seems to be, if you truly want truth, want reality, don't look for it in a story. Start by observing suffering, investigate what it actually is.
Because the answer isn't going to be another narrative. It's going to be rooted in that direct, often uncomfortable reality of experience.
Okay, so let's loop back to where we started. Are we defined by the stories we tell or by the suffering we can't ignore?
Well, it really seems Harari suggests that while we're absolutely driven to tell stories to find meaning, these stories are very often fictions. Powerful fictions, yes, reinforced by our identities, our institutions, rituals, and especially by sacrifice.
But they can blind us.
They can blind us to what might be the most fundamental reality suffering, both our own and others.
And maybe shifting our focus away from the endless hunt for the right story and towards honestly observing suffering. Maybe that's the path. Not to a new story, but to understanding reality itself. And maybe finding some freedom from that cycle of chasing meaning in fictions.
That seems to be the direction he's pointing. It's a challenging idea.
It really is. And it leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If understanding suffering is the key, as Harari suggests, and if our desires, our feelings, even our sense of self are largely biochemical and cultural processes, does real freedom lie somewhere unexpected? Not in getting everything we want, but maybe in deeply understanding why we want it in the first place, becoming less enslaved by the stories our own minds constantly spin.
Or is that pursuit, the pursuit of a no-story understanding, just destined to become another elaborate story we get trapped inside?
Something for you to ponder.